Hi, my name is Janine Stewart, Supervisor of Student Support in Frederick County Public Schools, here to talk to you today about restorative practices in school. We're going to be discussing the what, the why, and also how. We will discuss restorative theory and the goals of restorative practices in our schools. We'll look briefly at some historical connections between school resource officers and American policing, and apply some restorative approaches as the role of SRO or security assistant. So if you are in the field of education, it is likely and highly likely that you already have a wealth of background knowledge when it comes to restorative practices. We think of our restorative approaches as just the art of really building relationships. And so no matter what your career is, relationships are something that can be beneficial to all. And so as we work inside of schools and support schools, we teach many of our stakeholders, whether that be staff, students, or parents, to make sure that they stop and take time to acknowledge and celebrate diversity in their schools, to strategically find ways to bring students together, to bring staff members together, and to bring all of our community partners and our staff members and parents together as well. I served as a principal here out in Frederick County, Maryland. I've also been an assistant principal in Montgomery County and a teacher leader and a wealth of other things that help to shape our students. Typically, when you're in the field of education, you recognize the importance of care over content, but you also recognize how important it is to meet students where they are and to show up in places outside of the classroom. So with restorative practices, we are emphasizing the importance of doing things with. And as we speak about the social discipline window later in the hour, you'll see how there are different external and internal factors that will impact how everyone shows up on a given day. And so as we think about your role as school resource officers or your role as security assistants or educators, if you're watching this video, it is just really important because we all have our teachable moments and we should all be thinking about how we can be reflective about our interactions from day to day. So when I think about restorative practices, I also think about how I reflect on every interaction. We have good days and we have bad days in our schools, and we know that we recognize that the most important when we think with a restorative mindset is if something goes well, how can we continue to do that? And if there's something that we need to reflect on how we could have done it differently, we want to be restorative in mindset and think about that as well. And so I want you to know that I am confident that you are already doing restorative practices, but I'm just going to take some time to continue to help you reflect, because when I think about restorative practices, I think of reflection and I think about relationships. So thank you for taking the time to view this video today. And we will be looking forward to your feedback about what you are already doing, as well as something that maybe has resonated with you at the conclusion of this video. So the definition of a restorative approach is specifically restorative approaches are processes that can create a school climate that is just, equitable, conducive to learning, conducive for learning for all students. And they do this, people that are using restorative approaches, by being intentional, as I said earlier, about building community. That is 80% of the work that we want our schools to be doing when we're thinking about restorative practices or restorative approaches. Now, you may be familiar with the term restorative justice as well, because that stems from our work with the juvenile justice systems and all the research that restorative justice has. But restorative practices or restorative approaches specifically focus on being proactive, being preventative, being trauma sensitive, and recognizing once again the importance of relationship building and building community. That's 80% of the work that we want you to do. So be preventative, be proactive, build relationships with students, show them how they should be together productively and positively. We think about the ways that we have students kind of unstructured in our schools, hallway transitions, coming to and from school, in the cafeteria. Sometimes it's good to structure those times as well. I remember as a leader at Ballinger Middle School, taking the time to really think about how we could mix it up in our cafeteria. So our school counselors led activities where we sometimes allowed or invited our students to sit at tables with students who they didn't know. And we had question cards at the table to allow them to have mini circles at lunch and to get to know new students. Also, when you have new students who are coming into your schools, making a habit of ensuring that there is a new student paired with a veteran student to allow for, again, that building community. And we cannot forget about our new staff members and our parents as well. Because when we think about restorative practices, 80% of the work is intentional work proactively done prior to the 20% of the other part of the definition of restorative practices is addressing the harm and the conflict in a way that really holds people accountable and involves anyone that is impacted. So a lot of you may have the misnomer, or many others may think that restorative approaches or restorative practices is just about resolving or repairing harm. It really is more important to focus on the building of community. And I'll share with you some ways that you can do that. In addition to 20% of your work should be that harm and conflict, because if you put that extra effort, that build that social capital in advance, it's more likely when you have conflict that you have to resolve within your school community, it's going to be a lot easier to do. So the core values of restorative approaches are as follows: building and supporting positive connections among community members. School community members are important. They're like family. And so we want to make sure that we put in the intentional work to build that community or team or family. We also want to give stakeholders, each and every one, your students, your parents, your teachers, your staff, and anyone involved in your community. In our communities in Frederick, we usually spend a lot of time with many of our nonprofits and our other community partners. But everyone wants to have a voice in decision making, especially when it impacts them. We have something in restorative theory called the FAIR process. The FAIR process teaches us how important it is when we're thinking about decision making to engage all stakeholders, to take that time and do surveys, to get feedback, hold a listen and learn night when we're changing policies or procedures that are going to impact those in your community. That's the first E, engagement. The second E would be explanation. Taking time to explain why these decisions are needing to be made, what is the history and the background behind the decision, and also finally giving that expectation clarity. So when you think about restorative approaches, I want you to think high control. We are not giving up control when we're using or implementing a restorative approach. It is the exact opposite. We are doing high control, but we are combining that control with high support. So using the FAIR process to include people in your community in your decision making, whether or not you explicitly use exactly what they're going to say, or whether you just consider their feedback, it really allows you to get that buy-in, to allow for people to go above and beyond, and to allow for good messaging. Because when people are clear on expectations, they're able to communicate it on your behalf. The third bullet is belonging to a school community comes with social responsibility. A lot of times in some schools, you'll have a culture where there's like an administration versus the staff, or, there's a lot of feeling that there's one person responsible for the community. Well, in restorative approaches, we recognize that shared responsibility and shared leadership is how a healthy community is built. It is morally the social responsibility of everyone in a restorative community to make sure that they're successful. Using face-to-face dialogue to resolve conflict and to repair harm is also important in a restorative environment. It's a really important value to ensure that you create a space, a safe space. Usually it's a voluntary space as well, where you allow for people who have been harmed to resolve that conflict and to repair the harm whenever it's possible. There have been scenarios where I have decided not to use a restorative approach because one of the parties involved was just not ready or just not willing to accept the expectations. Remember, restorative, it's high control, high support. But we want to make sure that we do not re-damage or affect someone who's been harmed. And so we want to make sure we do our due diligence in our work to make sure that we bring people into a space that is going to be productive and that people are respectful and reflective before engaging in repair in a restorative conference. Usually if the conflict is really, really intense, it is a good idea to ensure that you have had a trained professional. So as we think about the restorative practices continuum, there are several tools that I'm going to share that will allow you to implement or continue using a restorative approach in your schools. You want to make sure that you're approaching actions that harm a school community through an educational lens, with the goal of helping the harmer accept accountability for their actions, but also learning from it and hopefully changing the behavior. So a restorative mindset in a restorative community is totally different from a punitive, but it still requires high accountability and high control. So why do we need to build community? Well, take a second to listen to this quote and reflect on what it means to you. Every society can control only those who perceive themselves to be members of it. Take a moment to think about what that quote means to you. For me, it just really reaffirms the importance of a restorative community and making sure that we are listening to our community members and understanding what it is that they need to feel welcome, making sure that we know who our individuals are in our community and that we're finding opportunities to get to know them and give them the support, the high support that they may need. A restorative approach has many positive impacts or can be very impactful in a school community. Let's take a look at some of them. The impact of a restorative approach or using restorative approaches in your schools can be building and sustaining a culture of kindness and respect, responsibility, and equity, emphasizing the importance of trusting relationships. If you think about your favorite teacher, your favorite coach, your favorite supervisor even, chances are you had a healthy, trusting relationships. Well, as a leader, a restorative leader, you are in a position of authority with any student within your school community. Most of the adults also will see you as a position of authority. And so building a trusting relationship comes along with what can be done as you use and implement a restorative approach. Also, building community and repairing relationships when harm occurs. There's a lot of research that talks about the reduction of recidivism and the strengthening of climate and culture. Another impact is developing healthy and productive responses to conflict. So we're continuously modeling what it is we want our staff, our students, and our community members to do when they have a conflict. And whenever we have two or more gathered, chances are you're going to have an opportunity to resolve conflict. We just want to make sure that it's a healthy response, a non-punitive. Now, I'm not saying that we'll never have punitive consequences, because obviously that's going to still exist in our society. There are going to be some discretionary and non-discretionary offenses that we will have to decide, will we use a restorative approach or a punitive approach? And I'll talk more about the social discipline window and when there are requirements for using a more punitive approach or punitive consequence. But I want you to know that when we think about restorative approaches, it's really about our mindset. It's not really about consequences. But the impact of using a restorative approach or restorative practices is that it does provide alternatives for us to use in addition to some of those punitive, non-negotiable consequences. And these healthy alternatives, more productive citizens are being built up and grown as they are learning to develop healthy and productive ways to respond when they have conflict. And they're more likely to change behavior and be held accountable still. This is the social discipline window. And when it comes to restorative theory, the social discipline window is the cornerstone of everything that we do with restorative approaches. If you look at the axis, you have structure, which is firmness, and you have support, right? So thinking about that, I want you to think about your favorite teacher, your favorite parent, your favorite coach, your favorite supervisor. Chances are they had very high expectations for you, right? They also provided support when you needed it. And so whether you messed up or you did really well, you still had a coach that believed in you. You still had a teacher that would not give up on you. You still had a supervisor who took the time to explain as well as support, give you clear explanations about what you're supposed to do, and provide you the opportunity, the resources in helping you to get there. That is our goal for all schools. Now, again, as I stated earlier, you're going to have external factors. For example, we just are still experiencing a pandemic. And so there's going to be external factors that are sometimes going to cause people that are normally very restorative in nature to operate in different windows of this social discipline window. Let me give you an example of myself as a principal and how at various times I moved from being a punitive, neglectful, and even permissive leader at times. Let's start with permissive, as most recent, many of our principals and school leaders have been, as we continue to see the impact of the pandemic, right? Care over content has been a theme in many of our schools, responding to needs for food, clothing, shelter, sickness. And so we have seen schools being more supportive. We have eliminated some of our accountability measures during the pandemic in terms of testing requirements. And so there are times where school leaders will have to be more supportive and less about control. As a school leader, we're hired sometimes to our positions and not necessarily to the schools. And as a school leader, at some point you'll get to your career where you will retire. So in those situations, you may see some people being a little bit neglectful, like the last week before retirement. I'm sure there's a lot of retirement ceremonies going on in place of maybe staff meetings. Addition, if you're getting transferred from one position to another, the last week of an opportunity of a school, if you're a school leader, you may be thinking about how you're going to celebrate staff rather than how you're going to complete different requirements that you have to get done as well. And so finally, the neglectful leadership could look like just a tired, remember I said external and internal factors can impact why a person is performing in a different box. And so a neglectful teacher could be overwhelmed or tired or exhausted and unable to really give high control or high support. As a school leader, I can remember high crisis situations where we had to operate in a more punitive fashion, right? For example, a fire alarm sounding and it's not planned. Well, you're in high control mode. You're not really thinking about how much support you're providing to each and individual student. You're relying on your trained staff members and adults and community partners to come and to make sure that fire drill happens or that evacuation occurs seamlessly. I know some school districts also time them. And so there are times where we are just punitive as a result of just being high control and not really allowing for support. When we've had unfortunate situations where we've had our shootings in our country, they are punitive responses. It is high control. We are working to make sure everyone is as safe as quickly as possible. So I want you to understand that as a security resource officer, as a security assistant, you may need to have walked in each of these mindsets in a given day and give yourself grace. At the end of the day, a restorative person, a restorative leader is one who can be reflective about their interactions, about their actions, and be able to evaluate themselves and the impact of what their actions are doing on others. And so the social discipline window is a tool that we use when we work with teachers. I'm sure you've seen or have, maybe if you're already working in the schools or have been for some time, permissive teachers who are all about support, but maybe have low structure. You may have come across a substitute perhaps that was neglectful and just was a body present in the classroom versus being very active. And so low control, low support. You may have come across teachers who are both restorative and punitive, who have really structured classrooms. The restorative teacher will have such good relationships with their students that even when there's a substitute present, that classroom is still going to function because they're all feeling like they're a part of that class community, and it's their job to ensure that it continues to function, whether the regular teacher is there or not. In a punitive style classroom, a teacher may have a lot of control when they're there and present, and there will be people following directions. But unfortunately, it's sometimes out of fear rather than out of doing a culture where there are people that really understand the expectations and really are working together with their teacher. So key words in the social discipline window: restorative people or leaders are doing things with others. When we have a punitive mindset, sometimes it feels like you're doing things to others. When you're having a neglectful mindset, it's like you're doing nothing at all or you're ignoring. And then finally, when you think of a permissive, it's kind of you're doing things for. So the terms to, with, for, and not generally are associated with the restorative theory and the social discipline window. I was trained in restorative practice by the International Institute of Restorative Practices. And if I invite you to join there or go to their website at iirp.edu if you'd like more information on the social discipline window. And there are a ton of other theoretical philosophies there that you can also listen and learn, including the FAIR process, which I talked about earlier. There are also a lot of introductory videos that can help supplement or help you hear more about restorative approaches. So restorative approaches are currently in Maryland schools as a result of some of our bylaws and laws that are governing the state of Maryland. And so all school districts are working to ensure that restorative approaches are in their schools and offered. Some of the ways that they're doing this is through community building circles, one of the most popular approaches to using restorative approaches. Restorative community building circles can be proactive, they can be academic, they can be check-ins, they can be check-out, they can be done with elementary learners, they can be done with middle school students, and also high schools. You can also use community building circles with your staff. As a principal, I used to start our staff meetings or our team meetings sometimes with community building circles where we got to know our staff, welcomed our staff, just checked in with staff. At the team level, team leaders also led community building circles just to talk and get to know their staff. Because remember, a restorative leader does things with others. And so creating a schedule or opportunities for you to use community building circles are a way to implement restorative approaches. And you will see many of our districts using them consistently. Community building circles are one of the proactive ways to use and implement restorative approaches. A responsive way would be a responsive circle, which you could use to repair harm. There are conflict resolution scripts. There's a book called Circle Forward that I recommend highly that has a list of many, many circles that can be used by anyone associated in a school, associated to a school community. There are several other books that I would mention, Hacking School Discipline, and then the IIRP also uses 2 books that give a lot of scenarios that will help you implement restorative approaches and understand and relate to how some other states have implemented, even at the SRO and security level, using restorative approaches. So I do recommend visiting their website as well. Restorative approaches currently in Maryland schools. We do have the Maryland State Department of Education also serving to help all of the points of contact for all of our counties talk about restorative approaches. So hopefully the school district that you're in has a person on that MSDE point of contact monthly meeting as well, because we are all sharing ideas and listening to how restorative approaches are currently being implemented in our schools in Maryland. So peer mediation is another way that you can implement restorative approaches. Obviously that involves training. Typically you see that with students between the 4th and 12th grade, serving as peer mediators, obviously being trained to help resolve some of our minor level incidents between other students. One of the really important aspects of the circle kind of concept is the reintegration circle. And we hope that when we're using some of those punitive consequences like suspension or expulsion or decisions about placements, whether they be temporary and alternative education, or as extreme as a detention center or juvenile justice facility, we want to make sure that if we are transitioning or when we are transitioning our students back into the school environment, we are doing those reintegration circles. They're very important. They allow for the right stakeholders to be brought to the table, for supporters, for anyone who is impacted or anyone who's going to help support the continuous growth of the student returning, to have kind of an opportunity to be reflective and to talk about the past, the present, and the future as we transition students back into school communities. Ultimately, we want to avoid stigmatizing, shaming of students, and we want to, even when we have them not meet our expectations, we're going to clearly, explain how our expectations failed to be met. But at the same time, we want to build a plan for success as students are reintegrated back into our school community. It is a disservice to our schools when we invite students back from a suspension without providing an opportunity to try to fix the harm that was done and those that were impacted. One of the stories that I will share at being in a school where a situation where an incident occurred and someone was hurt in the classroom, and all the students were impacted because they all saw the incident occur and the teacher was somewhat injured and some of the equipment in the classroom. It was important for me to do reintegration circles for even that student coming back to the classroom and allowing the peers to kind of explain how they felt. Now, obviously, those reintegration circles are more formal and take more planning, buy-in, and willingness for the participants to be vulnerable and to agree to be respectful even after experiencing a conflict with someone. Attendance mediation is another thing, as we all are tied to certain criteria for monitoring attendance. So the mediation process for attendance mediation focuses on multiple unexcused absences or tardiness of students, and involves a team approach, a collaborative approach to problem solving, and starting a conversation that allows a facilitator or a mediator to really get a solution oriented approach to, again, changing the behavior or figuring out what it is that needs to be done to improve the attendance. And so, again, restorative is doing things with people. And so, finding a parent, a guardian, a school counselor, a school representative, and having a collaborative problem solving approach can help with many of the incidents such as attendance that occur in our schools. And that's also using a restorative approach. Anytime you're doing being collaborative. We have a truancy reduction council in Frederick County that we use to really assess what is the barrier that we need to remove in order to increase attendance. Community conferencing is another opportunity, a process that's voluntary, that typically is facilitated by an outside partner. I know that in Frederick and Montgomery County, there's a program, a nonprofit called Lead for Life, and there's countless other ones that have partners with other services that they can provide, one of which is helping to resolve conflicts. And including the support of their networks and whatever staff members they have trained to help, again, with that restorative approach to allowing people to be heard and to make a plan to be held accountable to each other as you, again, repair harm or resolve conflict in the community. It is important that we consider a multi-tiered system of support. As we remember the definition of restorative practices, it is 80% about building community, but it's high control and high support. And so your school-wide behavior management program should use a multi-tiered system of support. Schools that are taking time to focus on tier 1 school-wide, which means all students, in implementing restorative approaches, which are prevention, education, and skill building, are going to exist in a healthier community than those who are not taking time to do those preventative and instructional skill building about what it is that you want and expect your students, your staff, and parents to be able to do as it relates to school-wide behavior management, and even as it relates to academics. Tier 1 strategies can look like PBIS programs or any other program that allows for education, modeling, practice, evaluation, monitoring of data for all students. A tier 2 system of support includes early intervention. As you are monitoring your data for all students, you will have an opportunity to see that some students are going to require a more targeted approach. A tier 3 system of support may need even more intensive intervention for individuals. So at the tier 2 level, you may have behavior support staff, you may have counselors, you may have therapists looking at group sessions where they're helping to prevent based on prior year's data, or to reinforce or redirect some of the challenges or areas of growth that they may see in students. In the tier 3 systems, it's important for us to identify individuals and provide high support. And so meeting as a school improvement team or whatever your MTSS system of support is really important as you consider restorative approaches using multi-systems of support, multi-tiered systems of support. So looking at it from a restorative mindset, community building circles offer you an opportunity to implement tier 1 approaches. Using restorative language. We'll talk about that in a moment, where you are giving direct feedback, where you are setting clear boundaries, and when you are promoting empathy. That is a tier 1 strategy. Restorative language, we call it effective language, and community building circles. A tier 2 strategy for implementing restorative approaches would be just small impromptu conversations. Again, thinking about how you can take any situation, whether it's proactive or responsive, and help a person to reflect on the past, the present, or the future. We can do this positively by goal setting with a person or student, or we can do this responsively when we are redirecting someone's behavior or interactions. Restorative circles are also ways to repair harm, whether it's 2 people or a group of students. Sometimes when you have a group of students, you need to take time individually to address situations before bringing the entire group together. For example, in one school environment, I needed to resolve conflict from students who were from different schools. And in this opportunity, I took time to meet with each of the school representatives or students first before bringing them together after an incident occurred. There were some students that I could not invite into the circle as a result of their unwillingness to commit to safety or to be respectful. There are some students who are invited into the circle who promised that they would not say anything. So the work on a tier 2 restorative circle is a little bit more than just using tier 1 restorative language. It takes a little bit more time. There are also topic circles. A lot of our schools are recognizing the importance of using their leadership teams, even their student leadership teams or their culture committees, to do circle series or listening circles. During the pandemic, we had a lot of school communities taking the time to address mental health needs and having circles about that, and other topics that came about during the pandemic. Finally, tier 3 circles are really important. Re-entry circles or tier 3 supports are important. One of the ideas for implementing a restorative approach is the re-entry circles, similar to the reintegration circles that we spoke about early, where you're taking the time whenever someone is returning from anything, whether it's a hospital stay or a suspension, having an opportunity to sit with a family, a support person, a staff member, the student, to ensure a plan for success is a tier 3 strategy. And additionally, family conferencing. A lot of times we will have parents and families that need a lot of wraparound services. And so a restorative approach could be bringing the right service providers to a meeting and identifying a plan for success using multiple partners. A lot of times school improvement teams will have opportunities to plan times for this to occur consistently within their planning time with teams. PBIS, Positive Behavior Interventions and Support, is a great way to implement multi-tiered systems of support, because all of the implementation strategies for PBIS and the requirements for PBIS schools really looks at all the things that you need when you're thinking about implementing a restorative approach. Defining and teaching expectations is a tenet of restorative and PBIS. Providing opportunities for checking in and checking out, a tenet of both PBIS and restorative practices, and making sure that you have high levels of support. Both restorative practices and PBIS require those. Social emotional learning interventions are also related to restorative practices. If you're doing that, you're already using a restorative approach. At a tier 1 level, again, providing SEL curriculum throughout your school, whether it's once a week, elementary schools probably once a day. Middle and high, not as much, but also still continuing to allow for education and development around social skills. It never gets too old. You think about our high school sports sometimes and how, the conflict can occur there. It's really important to teach about that. And so many of our schools are implementing social emotional curriculum into some aspect of their school days. You also want to think about targeting social skills instruction for those repeat offenders or those students who need additional layers of support to tier 2 or tier 3 level, and sometimes also individual social skills instruction. Mediation in the community should be done by trained mediators to ensure that it is done correctly, that the dialogue between all those involved really create solutions and produce agreements and really repair the harm. Remember, it's about the impact, the accountability, and the repair. And so many of our schools are choosing community mediations to resolve conflicts between students. We've already looked at the attendance mediation, so we're not going to repeat that. We've talked about peer mediation, and teen court is another way that problem solving can occur within the juvenile justice system, where teens are already charged with certain types of offenses, can be sentenced by a jury of the same aged peers. And I'm not sure how many counties this still exists in, but that's definitely also another restorative approach. So overall, mediations do count as a restorative approach, and they should normally be voluntary and confidential. And you set all those agreements when you conduct the mediation. They should be done by a neutral party, hopefully someone where the authority is not really something that's going to impact how students respond. And it's an opportunity to really have a conversation and to reach a mutually agreeable solution, not a directive. And so that's important to think about all those aspects. So we talked about an objective of looking at the American policing history and how it has evolved. And it's just important that as we consider, how we show up in our schools as authority figures serving as uh, police officers, that there's been a history in our American society that may be favorable to some and unfavorable to others. But understanding them is useful and hopefully preventing some of the barriers that may exist and preventing our relationships with students, especially our students of colors. Some examples of historical context could be slave patrols and just in general, their response to the civil rights movement. The two pictures at the bottom are from different years, but the messages, you know, are perceived differently by different people. And so it's important for us as restorative practitioners to be reflective about how we show up and how we perceive ourselves and how others perceive us as well. I can recall being a school leader and inviting my school resource officer into a circle for a new student. And a year later, I was no longer a principal at that school. And I saw that parent as I visited one time. And we had a pretty comfortable conversation. But he reminded me how disappointed he was about our first interaction. And our first interaction was a circle where I decided to bring our school resource officer who had great relationships with many of our students and would be another resource because this particular student came with a lot of needs and a lot of history of having conflicts in her other school community. And so for me, the four roles of a school resource officer, the last role is law enforcement. But when that parent saw that officer in his police uniform in our circle, it was an automatic reflection to what was unbeknownst to me, some of the history that the family had had with law enforcement. So as we seek to do as much as we can proactively with our students, with our parents, with our staff, we have to explicitly communicate our why when we use certain messages, or when we come in officers in uniform, or when we are inviting all stakeholders, which includes our SROs and our school security assistants, to some of our circles. We have to make sure that we introduce our why and be very explicit about the community approach and how important it is for all of our stakeholders to be supporters in our community. So continuing with the American policing history, our students are and have been lately bombarded with negative images from recent history and previous history, as we continue to see messages in our news different ways, and how it's being interpreted by even our youngest learners. The International Institute of Restorative Practices, where I was trained, they have a video where after the Baltimore riots, they took a restorative approach and used a restorative mindset to address elementary learners. And they did not ignore or avoid allowing discussions about what was happening in their community. Instead, they taught social skills and reminded students how important it is to be safe and to do things the right way and still communicate. And so it was a lovely video of teachers and students circling up, allowing time to explain what they saw and how they felt, and then getting a lesson about how you should remain safe, even when you see crisis or conflict around you. And so with this segment, we take some time generally in our training, our longer day training, to address about legitimacy and how important it is to build that legitimacy in terms of building trust as an SRO or as a school assistant, security assistant, to get that legitimacy built that removes some of those negative stereotypes that may exist and prevent barriers from relationships. So just remember that history can impact SRO student relationships, and that we want to be intentional about what we do and the work that we do to address discipline. We want to ensure that we avoid mistrusting and try to strengthen our relationships, especially by school community relationships. And so I know that our Boys and Girls Club and some of our other partners tend to do activities in our community with our partners and our school resource officers to ensure that we try to build positive relationships so they're not seen always as responders to crisis or conflicts. There are going to be in conflicting perspective on law enforcement, and the media is really, responsible for some of those. And we just need to understand that there are some people that fear and have distrust, and social media does really also impact that. The ACAB, if you're not familiar with that term, is All Cops Are Bad, was literally a movement in some areas, and something that, had to be overcome with some of our officers. So the public view that the SRO is entitled to exercise authority. Legitimacy talks about how that's earned, and student staff are more likely to accept SRO's decisions, to cooperate and to comply when they get that legitimacy and their relationship and their trust is earned. And so that is one of the things that many of our school resource officers are looking to do to strengthen. It is a lot on our school administrators, though, to enforce the 3 other opportunities that security resource officers or even security staff members have in our school community. We really rely on you and your role to be emergency managers, rely on you to be those informal counselors and those educators of different topics that we might not be as school administrators as knowledgeable on because we're not in the community. I know that as a building leader, principal, there were many nights that we had parent nights, and the school resource officers would come in and be able to educate us on different apps, different illegal drug things that students paraphernalia would have, and just to really educate the parent PTSA and even student community. So definitely work with your school administration to, one, be clear on when the law enforcement side is being used, and the option of doing something punitive versus really working to emphasize your role as informal counselor, as educators, as emergency managers, skilled one, right? And helping to train schools in that. Um, so the SRO is truly the most and can be restorative position that we have in law enforcement. And I do hope that everyone sees their roles in each of those three, in addition to being law enforcement. And so when my supervisor, Dana Falls, and I presented at the summer conference, we said SROs are restorative. And so we need to make sure that we communicate that our roles as SROs include informal counselors, educators, and emergency managers, and law enforcement as well. So, because many people are just not familiar with those other roles, and it all depends on how you're being used in your schools. So, restorative approaches and community policing. Well, when I think about the two, thinking about that last definition of those four roles, it can be very aligned. The goals of community policing is to build relationships with the community. The goals of restorative approaches are to build community 80% of the time. Community policing does this through local agencies to reduce social disorder, and restorative approaches are looking to develop a sense of accountability to the community, and to improve the climate and culture within the school and to build that trust between staff and students. So they're not so different. Promoting resilience is also a restorative approach and community policing that promote resilience in our youth by creating increasing protective factors like family bonding and family ties and strengthening family units, building connections to our community, making sure that they're involved in the community and you're bringing the community into your schools, building on the cultural beliefs and developing an appreciation for diversity, and ensuring that every child, and some may connect better to law enforcement partners, has a meaningful adult in their life. So the school to prison pipeline is a lot associated with the restorative practices work, more associated with the restorative justice work, but it talks about how when we expose students early to our juvenile justice system, they're more likely to end up continuing or staying in that path. And so at all times, we try to avoid implementing such restorative, non-restorative approaches, and think about always where we can implement alternative approaches, when at all possible. And there's lots of research on the school to prison pipeline, and I invite you to definitely take time to explore that as you reflect on creating the restorative mindset or affirming your restorative mindset, because many of you may already have that. So by definition, the school to prison pipeline is best understood as a chain of policies and practices that have the cumulative effect of pushing students out of school. And unfortunately, when they're out of school, they're not under our control and could end up doing things that could lead them into the juvenile or criminal justice system. So the theories explain that the school to prison pipeline is caused by a combination of factors. Number one being zero tolerance, and how at some point in our historical journey of education, we had a high reliance on zero tolerance policy to really combat the violence that we were seeing in schools. And the disciplinary policies and practice were all about zero tolerance. And so that is one major factor with the school to prison pipeline theory. Additionally, consequential and biased disciplinary decisions by teachers and administrators, not really having clear school-wide behavior management code of conducts, and separating kind of the staff versus the office or even the law enforcement consequences, and kind of having blurred lines. And then having a lot of implicit bias happening. And so a lot of schools are working to eliminate some of those bias by really looking at their discipline code of conducts and things like that, and having a more collaborative approach even when you're suspending. I had one admin team that I work with in Montgomery County where before we decided on a punitive conference or consequence, we brought all of the administrators together to vote and to decide together and to talk through our why, and how many, if we were doing a suspension on a days, that helped us to eliminate any bias that maybe the person who initiate the consequence had. Increased police presence in our school, again, as it relates to the violence that's occurring across our nation, is also a contributing factor to the school to prison pipeline. And then just the criminalization of the code of conduct infractions, and then even the way it's written and the way it's implemented and enforced can also elicit feelings and structures that will replicate the prison settings, in school suspension, things like that. And so also finally, segregated and under-resourced schools, unfortunately, are another contributing factor to our school to prison pipeline. So schools, as well as students in our schools, mainly students of color, are being moved into the juvenile justice system, and the research has changed slightly to include other demographics as well as sometimes our students with disabilities. Um, and a lot of the research is pointing towards Black females too, having a higher increase in this school to prison pipeline research. But using SROs is linked to increased rates of exclusionary discipline, according to Fisher and Hennessy, in the criminalization of student behavior. And so it's important for us to understand that this research is out there, and that there is a lot of consideration for policies and legislation related to this. And so it's just important for us to understand this and understand that arresting students in schools for things that are simple, when you could consider alternatives to suspension, especially when we're getting SROs involved in disorderly conduct, or things that, again, it goes back to the administrator's role in ensuring that they're not inviting SROs to the scene for minor level events, because we do not want our children developing arrest records for when they're acting in a way where they're not fully aware, or they're being children, in other words. And so it is important for us to work with our school administrators to remind them of when it's inappropriate, and to invite them to call supervisors if we have a disagreement on a decision. in terms of whether we should be arresting or charging or things like that. So the reality is real, and there are laws and lots of legislative talks about the Maryland State Department of Education has released data on arrest related to first-time offenders. And so in 2018, MSTE released data on school-related arrests for the first time. And you can see on the screen that these are the data facts. I'm not going to read them all to you, but they are from the 2015-2016 school year on arrest. And then there's arrest rates. And then there's national school-related arrests, 1.2 per 1,000 students, according to the United States Department of Education Office of Civil Rights. And so Black students were the only racial group arrested at a higher rate than their proportion of school enrollment at the state level and across the districts. And so having Black students represented at 66% in 2015, 2016, obviously lots of conversations about these arrests. Additionally, I mentioned students with disabilities were also disproportionately arrested, and more 2.45 times as likely to be arrested at the school level than those without, according to a study done in 2018. So I'm sure you have heard about this data, and it just, again, reinforces our use of restorative approaches in our schools. And so I am going to talk to you about how you can implement restorative approaches. And the first way is your communication. So effective communication, spelled AFFECTIVE, or restorative language, is one way we seek to implement restorative approaches. And at a tier 1 level, that would look like understanding that we need to consistently think about how we communicate within the school environment. Are we giving clear directions? Are we giving explicit feedback? Are we creating boundaries? Are we promoting empathy? Because our language matters. And so does it matter to all stakeholders how we communicate. I'm sure you've talked about de-escalation. And so when we think about the English language in general, there can be a lot of hidden triggers for people from different walks of life, particularly words that may have been used in war or in the military or even in prison. And so it's important for us to think about our language as the first step at thinking about a restorative approach or a restorative mindset. Words are especially powerful during conflict situations. So starting first with the proactive side of restorative approaches, words should be catching them doing it good more than you're catching them doing things bad. When you're in a bad moment, remember, I can't emphasize enough how words are especially powerful during conflicts. And our language can either escalate or de-escalate emotions from whoever we are supporting. And remember that we are the adults. We are responsible for remaining in control, even when all kinds of colorful language is coming our way, even when we feel threatened. It is important for us to try our best to use restorative language. And so it is going to have an impact on students when we have language that reminds students or even staff or community members about, different historical moments, criminal justice, war, military, prison, just being culturally different and having experience or having family members who have experienced or witnessed, or just having a louder voice in some communities versus those who may not be familiar with it. And then there's groups that just like our minority groups who have historically been unwelcome and unvalued or uncelebrated. So we have to think about how we, as again, authority figures, are already seen as, an authority figure. And unless you have built the social capital, we want to avoid using language that's going to escalate, even though our intention is never to escalate a situation. How we talk and what we say can trigger um, some of our people of different walks and different races and different backgrounds. And so just keep that in mind as we think about a restorative mindset. Very much includes the first step of how and what you say when you're communicating. So we're going to take the war out of our words. And there's a lot of work done on that. There's Sharon Ellison's work, The Art of Powerful Non-Defensive Communication, that I invite you to explore. So in our training, we generally take some time. If you want to pause this video, if you're watching it with a team, and in some small groups, take some time to think about some of the words or phrases that we use in our schools that unintentionally might reference war, might reference military, might reference prison, or even the criminal justice system. And think about, maybe you've seen a response from someone that you triggered and unintentionally did so. So let's pause the video and take a moment to think about that, either independently or with your small group. All right, hopefully you have taken an opportunity to reflect in your small group. And I am going to pause for a moment to give you time for a break. All right, welcome back. Hopefully you have taken some time to think about the language that we use in our school that could have triggered in someone. And now we're going to talk about effective language. Effective language, if you're taking notes, is really attempting to communicate what may not be known by the person you're communicating to, right? And so when I think about it, I'm thinking about how I'm giving specific feedback. You are aware of the expectations in this class. How can I support you in meeting them? I'm giving boundaries, like I know you're aware. I'm giving expectations. I need you to get the work done. And I'm providing support. I know that you're capable. You're aware. So what do I need to get it done? Okay. High control, high support. That's effective communication. So PBIS offers examples for teaching explicitly, again, direction. Our PBIS schools are going to also be modeling. So if they're teaching bus behavior, they're going to be going on the bus and modeling what they want. If they're teaching cafeteria expectations, they're going to be going to the cafeteria, lining the students up, teaching them exactly what they want them to do, how they want them to do it, trash, everything. And so explicit is important when you're thinking about communication. And so practicing even communicating with students and practicing appropriate responses to teachers is a way to use and practice effective language. We also have effective question cards that we can use that really promotes engagement of reflection and holding students accountable, and ask questions like, what happens, right? It doesn't ever ask why, but it asks what happened. We'll talk about that later on today when we go through that. But also, what were you thinking at the time? It also may ask, what do you think can be done to make things better? It will ask who was impacted by what happened, right? And so all those are reflective accountability questions, which you may or may not have to support someone in answering. But the goal is to communicate past, present, and future, and to reflect on either goal setting if it's positive, or redirection if you are helping someone uh, resolve a conflict. So thinking about the adolescent learners, I don't need to give too much information. I know you have a lot of background information on the adolescent brain and how the processing for a younger adult is and where it occurs and on all those, but it's definitely important for us to think about brain development as we think about communication, right? The majority of brain development happens by 5 years old, which is why it is so important for babies to be read to, talked to, educated, and given lots of affection. That doesn't always happen in all of our homes. So, what is missed at younger ages can dictate what happens in all aspects of their life at older ages. And adolescents whose mental and emotional needs were not met as a child doesn't know how to connect in healthy ways. And so a lot of work needs to be done with therapists and counselors to negate those situations. And the child who generally only knows how to meet his or her needs um, lacks empathy towards others, and can be a predictor of personality disorders. And so a lot of our school districts are also increasing social, emotional, and therapeutic services or positions as well, as a restorative approach. Uh, Trauma in the adolescent brain are, as you are probably aware, very much connected, and any major trauma in one's life stops his or brain development at that age in one respect or another. And when the child doesn't receive love and care or proper stimulation at a younger age, they have little or no ability around how to respond to like normal life stressors. And this can make them feel impossible to reach and more likely to join gangs for that love and that family. So, again, our jobs as informal counselors and educators are important, and using that trauma informed or trauma sensitive approach, which is what restorative practices does, focusing on reflection, accountability, restoration, um, more restorative approaches versus the punitive ones, is what this work is all about. And children affected by trauma may overreact to situation. We have a theory in restorative approaches called the compass of shame. If you look at the compass of shame, you'll see 4 ways that typically students are going to respond when they are, victims of trauma, when they are triggered and have experienced a sense of shame about themselves for not meeting an expectation or shutting down. So those 4 ways are avoidance, right? You've seen it, I'm sure. Withdrawal, you've seen students just kind of just shut down completely. You've seen them attack themselves sometimes. Our suicide rates around trauma is really high, and then attacking others, obviously, to different degrees. And so just remember that as we are being authority figures and looking to resolve conflict, we have to keep in mind the impact of trauma on those who probably need our support the most, and they're not going to be the ones most willing to give us the opportunity to do so. And so this is why we use restorative approaches, because it offers that emphasis on relationships, community building, community building, before we have to respond to a conflict. So it looks different at every level. For those of you in the elementary, obviously you understand that on a developmental level, they need to be very active, need frequent rest periods, help with eye-hand coordinations. They have a couple of best friends, need to play with others to develop social skills. They become aware of gender roles, At that age, they need to express feelings. They have frequent angry outbursts at the elementary level and jealousy amongst their classmates, and they have a need for social approval. That can lead to an increased opening for obviously bullying to begin. So the work that we're doing with social emotional development is usually pretty high at our elementary levels, which helps us when they get to middle school, where they start to physically develop and girls mature and boys mature a little bit slower, and both experiencing hormonal changes, and children move from concrete thinking to more abstract thinking. And so the conversations change, the attention spans change. And then you get to the high school level and the development of characters are a little bit different. Hormones are in full blast, and they're trying to understand each other and become involved in sexual activities and other things, and more drawn to each other and looking at interests and their interests and figuring out themselves, and specifically learning regarding relevance to activities needs to be really structured at this age and strategic. So the 4 stages of development that we're going to talk about next are the restorative questions. So we have effective language, and we have to think about, the various levels of people that we're dealing with in the school, elementary, middle versus high, and how we're interacting. But then the next thing on our restorative practice continuum after language, and both of these are tier 1 strategies, would be the restorative questions. And these 5 questions offer you really good flexibility in terms of minor level incidents and even major level incidents. I have done restorative conferences with second graders. I've done them with parents. I've done them using these 5 questions with staff members and other staff members. And so I just want to emphasize the easiest way to implement restorative approaches from your language, using feedback, boundaries, and empathy, and also using these questions. And you can create your own questions as long as you develop questions that promote reflection about the past, about the present, and the future, but never asking the question, why? Okay. When and where to use the 5 questions? Well, anywhere, in the hallway, on the bus, in the cafeteria, on the playground, immediately following an infraction, or after the students have cooled down. Tact and timing is very important, right? A lot of times when I would involve students or pick up a student from a classroom after a conflict with either a student or a staff member, I wouldn't even talk about the incident initially. When you think about a restorative approach, your first thing should be your language, thinking about that, but also the relationship. Do you even have a relationship to be able to be restorative? Because to be restorative without having a relationship, it doesn't really work. And so sometimes you have to spend time just getting to know a student before you can even help them resolve a conflict. Disclosing a little bit about yourself and your history and your experiences to help them connect. And even when we do those community building circles, a lot of times if they're restorative, I'm always going to start off with a community builder to get to know the people in the room. So these questions can be used on the spot, after an infraction, during a reintegration circle, but more often they should be done focused, structured, and sometimes when they're like just a chat, it obviously should be done privately. A lot of our schools are also doing reflection sheets where they allow these questions to be put on a reflection sheet and to be done that way as well. Circle in the Square is a really good book that talks about restorative chats and specifically. So if you want to get more information on that, another text to use for the questions. So here are the questions, and they may look different depending on what county you're in and who developed the questions. But again, it gets to the past, what happened, what were you thinking and feeling? It gets to the present, what have you been thinking and feeling since? Who was affected by your actions and how? And then the future, Well, what can you, emphasis on you, can do to make things better? Because it's high control, it's accountability for your stakeholders. So let's break down each of these questions. Question number 1, what happened? This is an opportunity for you to use genuine curiosity. Even if you already know what happened, you've already watched the cameras, you know what happened, it is your opportunity to build a little relationship, build a little community. I know it's harder if you already know the facts, but you have to make sure that you hide your true feelings and engage using the fair process, innocent until proven guilty, right? With this question, you're looking for information about the student's state of mind rather than the truth. And the truth only comes out one way. And sometimes you gotta reinforce that. Listen, students, scholars, the truth only comes out one way. But sometimes it's different, right? And so with this question, you wanna know what they're telling you. Sometimes you are taking notes, sometimes you're letting them write it down. But question number 1 is really about, give me your details, your details. This question generally takes the longest. And you may need to circle back to it later after you've gone through all the other questions, and that's okay, because some of they may have forgotten some of the story, and by the time they get to the other questions, they're reminded and they have to tell you more about what happens. Or as you listen to some of the other answers, you might need to know more about what actually happened. But you're patiently listening, and it's going to be worth it to get the whole picture, side story from, and earn a little bit of trust by engaging in listening, actively listening. Question 2, what were you thinking and feeling at the time? Again, you can rearrange this question or prompt however you want to, but you're using thinking and feeling interchangeably, right? So if a student struggles to answer, switch it from thinking to feeling, or however you're going to get the best reaction. Sometimes you have to model or give examples, but help them to put themselves back into that exact moment when they made that bad choice. Clues about the setting, help me picture, help me understand is what I always use. Were you at the table, were you sitting? You're just, again, just getting clarity so that you are helping them to reflect. You're also reflecting with them. Ask what they physically felt. You know, were you like upset, and did you ball your hands? Was your heart racing? Were you so angry by what that person said or did to you? The goal is to help the student identify the emotions that they experience right when they were involved in the incident, so they can begin to recognize the poor choice, if it was a poor choice, and heal or make a better decision, right? And so there's 2 question cards using the International Institute of Restorative Practices question. So in addition to this, which can be used for any challenging behavior, these 5 questions, there's also a set of questions that can be used when you know that somebody's been harmed, and you might just ask them, you know, what were you feeling at the time, or what was the impact, rather than saying what happened, because your goal is to really resolve a conflict by using multiple peoples, but starting more so with the reflection and the impact. So again, this question 2 is related to specifically resolving a conflict with someone. Question 3, what have you been thinking since? Always give an opportunity for students to calm down. And again, you want to be private. So an office, just not around anyone else that embarrasses them. Obviously, you want them to have cooled down so that they can access the part of the brain that needs to help with problem solving and thinking. This question assesses the student's degree of accountability. Remember, restorative is high control, accountability, and also the promotion of empathy, so the remorse. So you're trying to, you know, identify where they are. Knowing that can help you determine the level of discipline that may be required, the alternatives to discipline. If a student is still willing to fight, that's one thing. If a student really, you know, gets it and they're regretful, that could be another consequence. So this question can help you determine a consequence unless it's obviously one of those, there's no discretion and it's a non-negotiable consequence, then you use your best judgment. Question 4, who has been affected by your actions and how? This is where accountability is key, and we want everybody that's impacted to be, listed. It can be hard for some of our students who don't get how their behaviors impact others, but it's one of the most crucial for student learning. So you may have to help. If you're looking to do a circle where you're having 2 people answer these questions, you might have to start with the one and practice the answers before you bring the 2 together. Students first and generally first answer with me or no one, but you want to help them to see the ripple effect when things happen. So if you're on a bus and you got into a fight on the bus, well, not just you, the students around you, the bus driver, the people in the community may have been impacted. If the bus driver had to pull over, I mean, we want to make them have a teachable moment and to change the behavior. One key to successfully asking this question is to help them identify what community their action affected. The community of the bus stop, the community of the front office, the cafeteria, 5th grade lunch, and then asking kind of like who was there, where were you? Again, that helps with question number 4 as well. It's about impacts instead of being affected. And you can use those words interchangeably to really help with question 4 as well. Question 5, it is written sometimes as what can you do to make things right? But I do like using what can you do to make things better? Because ultimately, it's not a magic pill, right? Restorative approaches are not going to always resolve every conflict, but hopefully it will reduce the repetition of those conflicts because it changes behavior by the intentional work with understanding and resolving the conflicts. So students seldom think that they can do something to repair the harm, but be patient with them. They often are able to come up with at least one thing because maybe they've been here before, or maybe they've seen something that someone has done to positively change a situation for the better. Taking action gives them a feeling of empowerment. So we definitely want them to be involved in this decision. Don't accept easy answers or answers that that are not going to work. Like, I'm going to stay away from her. Well, if you're all in the same 5th block class, you can't stay away from her, right? So just really seek to really create a plan here with question number 5 and hold them accountable. It's not about we, it's about them. So use the you instead of we. It's their action and they're repairing it. It's their responsibility to make things better. And promising not to do it in the future is not good enough. They need to also figure out how to repair what they did. And sometimes you have to involve parents in this. I've had to pick up the phone and call parents and invite them and explain, kind of what their child has shared with me as their plan of action. And even that can be helpful. So we're going to pause the video again to allow you to have time to look at these scenarios to allow for role play. Each of these scenarios can be discussed with your group if you're in a group training and allow you to look at how a restorative approach can be used and how the 5 questions can be used. So here's one scenario. You're on the bus lot and you hear a commotion from one of the areas in the front of the bus. You rush over and you see a student throw down her backpack and challenge another to a fight. Well, you recognize the girl as someone with whom you have mentored. You secure the area and then you escort her to the office and you use the 5 questions. Well, what I love about this scenario is the fact that there is a mentoring relationship and an opportunity with a trusted adult. I like that there is immediate interaction, but the 5 questions would be an appropriate tool to use with this scenario. There may be coaching needed, but it definitely allows for scenario 1 to be used. Use the restorative questions for scenario number 1. Scenario number 2, you're called to a classroom and a student is screaming at a teacher in front of the class near the doorway. secure the safety of the situation. You walk to the student, to your office. As they're calming down, you begin to ask the 5 questions to help assess the level of accountability the student feels so that they can share with school administrators. So another scenario very likely to happen. Obviously, you're not going to stop and do this in front of the class or in the earshot. You're, again, taking them to a secure, safe place to be able to help them to cool down. The walk in general helps them to cool down. And sometimes beginning the questions while you're walking is also helpful because you're not like directly in front of them or standing up over them. It does help with that. And then you're also prepping them maybe for a group conversation with the administration who will also follow up and share those questions. So another opportunity for you to help with the accountability by just, helping them process what happened. What were you thinking? Who was impacted? What are you going to do to make things better before they get to the administration's office? And so then they begin to get used to that process. What happened? What were you thinking? What should you have done? All those kind of questions, anything that's going to promote reflection and create a plan for making a better choice in the future and changing behavior. Question 3, 5 questions. Question 3, you see a 7th grader, right? A boy wandering in the hall, as he often does. You have a good relationship with him, restorative, and want him to return to class so that he can get his education. Just before he sees you, he reaches down, reaches up, rips down a complex bulletin board display and ruins it. You walk with him and you use those 5 questions. So imagine this scenario and the response is punitive. Why did you do that? What are you doing? And how that can escalate a situation rather than just being consistent. It's a little bit more complex than the last scenario when the teacher was yelling and you've already removed them from the classroom as no teacher, but now they're in the hallway amongst other people perhaps, and you still use those restorative questions. Consistency, equity, people feel that they can trust because it's the same process every time. Another scenario, after being called to an altercation in the front hall, as students are arriving, you secure the safety, arrange for each of the 2 girls who were screaming at each other to be put in separate office. You sit with one girl at a time and use the same 5 questions and help them to understand what they did, how it was harmful, who was affected, and what they can do to make things better. So lots of opportunities where you can use these 5 questions, different scenarios, but the key is equity and just because it's doing the same thing with all of these different scenarios. So circles can repair harm. And it may differ by your school who can lead them, but usually want to train adults to lead a circle in circles where everyone is affected, everyone should be a part of it, everyone's perspective should be heard, and you should attempt to resolve a conflict together to make a plan to resolve the conflict. It often can occur following and should occur after the discipline, even another discipline, right? It can be in collaboration with some other discipline, but the circle is about the repair. And it usually is by someone who's been trained to lead them. So typically SROs won't lead the circles, but they can participate in them. If you are doing just a listening circle, you could lead a circle. Depending on your topic though, it's important to be mindful of who you might need. If it's a topic on like after a suicide in a building, or after a school shooting and you're doing something, obviously you want trained facilitators, right? If you've had a group of students who just cannot get over a situation, you might have a counselor be a part of a circle, a SRO. And so repair is important. We've had so many incidents in our schools where sometimes life just continues to go on and there's no opportunity for people to heal or to repair harm, and the angst still exists and the tension still exists in our school communities. And it just continues to have situations escalate rather than begin to hopefully repair or reduce conflict. So trained officers can, and I have trained our school resource officers in both restorative approaches and facilitating circles. Participation is always optional, and it should be optional and not forced. But also remember that SRO's role in those 4 roles, and then 3 as an educator, as a informal counselor, your perspective is very enlightening to students and helpful to even parents. So I definitely want us to consider how you can be used in circles. And if you're in a circle, whether you're a participant or a facilitator, you want to think about physical safety. When I've had students who really don't like each other and have demonstrated it by getting into an altercation, I physically separate them in different sides of the room. And even when parents are with them, I still have them on separate sides of the table. We want to assess who should speak first, how people are feeling. Sometimes I use it on a scale of 1 to 5. How's everybody feeling right now about this situation? And sometimes I use the people who are really upset and let them go first. And then I let the other person hear what that person is thinking. And then I ask the questions to the other person. So I invite you to go to the IRP website, because the question cards from the IRP.edu website, there are 100 cards for like $10, and they have a side 1 and side 2. And side 1, as I was sharing earlier, focus specifically on the challenging behavior or goal setting. And the other side focuses on when you know someone has been harmed. There's also a conflict resolution script that helps you set expectations at the beginning of a circle prior to the restoration part. And so again, the resources can be used by anyone who's been trained with restorative. There's lots of resources out there. I can send anyone who's interested. Again, I'm Janine Stewart, Jeneen, last name Stewart at fcps.org if you want resources about circles. But the balance is important. When I talked about the scenario when we had 2 different schools and 2 different students being apart, or students from 2 different schools being apart, it is essential that you are able to ensure that you have a balance, and maybe you have to do multiple circles in order to get things done. Mental health is important. And the possibility of re-victimizing people. We don't ever want to do that. And what are people's motivations? Are they going to be respectful? Are they going to meet your expectations? All those are important. So to repair harm circles, it's a chance for all involved to hear each other's perspective. It's an opportunity for adults to model healthy conflict and resolution. It's an opportunity for teaching to help students understand that their actions affect others. And it's an opportunity for some students to disentangle themselves from conflict, right? It's not a magic pill. It's not a one and done. And sometimes you have to do multiple conferences, but it is an answer for everyone to really be involved in resolving the conflicts. So there is more information that I can share, but I'm going to stop this video here and produce another video that will allow for more theoretical background. But this video really highlights and summarizes the information that we present in our 8-hour training. I didn't go into as much detail, but it does summarize for you veterans who have already had a restorative practices training. And I know that you have connected with something that I've shared, and I know that you're already doing the restorative work. And so I invite you to continue to be restorative and to reach out to me with any questions that you have about restorative implementation or circle implementation. Thank you so much and have a wonderful afternoon.